Hi, Matt here. In today's video, I'll be talking about Buddhism and sharing with you what I know about Buddhism, as well as clearing up some misconceptions about Buddhism, specifically regarding what it's not. Buddhism is not exactly a definitive statement about suffering, or that life is suffering. This is largely a Western interpretation coming from people who know it's like a myth, right? I mean, from those who know a little bit about Buddhism, but not enough to know that it's actually designed to be the answer to suffering. So, and actually make life better. And it's not a negative view upon the world or a negative statement about reality, or really a negative philosophy, anything like that. So Gautama Siddhartha Buddha was born in 566 BC, and he lived for around 85 years until 480 BC. And as you know, he was born as a prince. Well, you may not know, but I'm telling you, he was born as a prince in a wealthy kingdom, and he had never known really what suffering was because he hadn't seen it. He had lived in his palace walls, and what he knew of life was, it was a very luxurious, happy, sheltered life, in which he probably got almost everything that he wanted and didn't have to work as hard. Maybe, he had to prove himself in certain ways, but the point is, he wasn't aware of that suffering even existed, right? Can you imagine that, not knowing what suffering is? Well, Buddha didn't know. And so he stepped outside one day from his palace, and he met four people. A ill man, an ascetic who was dying, who was, starving or something, suffering in that manner, much worse, a corpse, and an old person who was dying. And so he interpreted this as suffering, but he still, wanted to go out, and he still hadn't really, resolved anything other than to go find out and try to understand suffering, what it is, and, what the meaning of suffering is, as well as what the answer and the cure to suffering itself is. So he gave up his princely title and his royal position and his palace. Imagine that you have a palace and you give it up. Where most of us are in life. But, I might consider doing the same thing if I found out that my life was not what it appeared to be. So, after giving that up and discarding all of his possessions, Buddha spent, the next, 5, or I think it was like 8 years meditating under a tree. And then one day he had an awakening, and he had sort of transcended suffering and realized what the answer to suffering is. And of course he was in an awakened state, so he viewed things already different than other people, and he didn't suffer probably the way most people did. I'm sure he was a bit hungry, but so after his awakening underneath the Bodhi tree, what Buddha realized it was that there are 4 noble truths which will lead to the resolution of pain. And those are that suffering exists, that there's a cause of suffering, and that there's a cause of the end of suffering, a way to bring about the end of suffering, and that, basically suffering could be resolved. That suffering, that there's an end to suffering, and that there's a cause that brings about the end of suffering. So, if you follow these noble truths, it's basically, first of all, acknowledge that suffering exists. Acknowledge that there's causes to your suffering, right? That you have a lack of insight, perhaps. And so that's very important to Buddhism, is having the insight and the clarity and, sort of the contemplation, or even, in some, maybe, by today's standards, the patience to look into suffering in your life and realize what the answer to that is. So, when we identify the components of suffering, we'll be able to solve it more. So like I said, there's a cause of suffering, and then after that, okay, well, there can be an end to suffering. I mean, we know people who certainly don't suffer as much as we do, or like older, wise, sage type of people that don't, constantly suffer, even if they have hardships in their life that they're dealing with. And you could actually make a parallel with this, I think, to Christianity, and how Christianity brings an end to suffering. So, and then the cause to the end of suffering is, sort of being open to this possibility of awakening. And this awakening in Zen is called Satori, which is basically a spontaneous awakening to suffering, and the realization that without disorder, we can't have order. You need disorder in order to have order. So that's something which begins to change your entire view of the world and all the suffering that's going on. Without some disorder happening, let's take the example of your body and your bloodstream. Without there being bacteria in your body that are doing certain things, and your body, dealing with taking out with its antibodies the viruses within it, or its antiviruses, eliminating those viruses. That if we don't have a million, I think actually more like 1 trillion bacteria in our body, then we're not we don't have a healthy body. You actually need to take care of it with probiotics and eating the correct diet, or at least relatively. American diet is pretty good, but eat a decent diet and a healthy bacteria considering diet, or just maybe trust in your body and let it do its thing. That helps. But we need that kind of chaos in our bodies in order to have a well-functioning body. Likewise, we can see that without bees and various insects, which you may despise, like ants, or at least you don't want ants around, right? Without those, then we can't have the natural environment being healthy and the way that we live in it now. And without bees, there can't be flowers. There's that relation. So you may begin to look at life and realize, hey, without the disorder that's happening in my life right now, without all this crazy stuff happening, I couldn't even appreciate, the little joy, the relaxation, and the peace that I have when it all stops. Because being able to experience one thing fully means dealing with a certain amount of suffering in another area, unfortunately, or chaos, as I say. Doesn't really, in Buddhism, we aim to transcend suffering. One thing that is realized in Buddhism is that there are 5 different categories, or 5 different realms of beings that exist. So there's the demigods, the gods, who they live in a realm in which they get to experience all kinds of great things, festivities and joys and, different things that we couldn't possibly imagine experiencing. But they also experience envies and, jealousy and other torment and suffering that humans don't experience. And so you don't really want to be, say, a demigod, because their experience actually involves level of suffering. If you're envying another person, or say you look at plants as a demigod, or butterflies or bees, and you're envying them, and likewise humans, or it could be another demigod. Well, that's the problem. You start getting better experiences in one way, and let's say everyone had some kind of amazing, everyone has an amazing house, an amazing boat, an amazing car, or an incredible relationship, and basically it comes down to other things like an amazing yard. Well, if everyone had something that was just so incredible, then you might start envying another person. Likewise, if you had control over certain things, like certain powers, Zeus sometimes envies Poseidon, even though Poseidon is the more powerful god, or Hades envies Zeus. And this being the case, this conflict of power, it creates this conflict, and we don't want that. Humans don't necessarily have this ceaseless conflict. So as much as our world is chaotic as our world is, we don't have these problems of ceaseless, unresolvable conflicts, right? And likewise, the animals and the plants, animals and the different forms of lesser beings. I'm trying to get this right, but basically they may experience suffering that an animal can go through a lot of suffering and pain, which a human can't even imagine. Sure, it is true that we experience our pain more acutely, but at least we're not suffering in the same way. And I think as a human, we're happy to know that, right? And humans are also the only one inhabiting any of these realms, the only sentient life that has the capacity to obtain enlightenment, because we're not at the top and we're not at the bottom, but we have the awareness and the ability to obtain nirvana, because we're not preoccupied with managing a realm, or doing our job to facilitate the environment in the exact way that a bee is, or various types of animals are, and like a plant is, right? A plant's job essentially is just to do what it's supposed to do and grow, and it doesn't have much of a sentience, but it still does what it does very well. Well, even though plants are very beautiful, at least as humans, we can say that we can obtain this satori, this awakening, this nirvana, as the Buddhists originally called it, and it will allow us to transcend suffering and not experience it in the harsh way that we normally do, because we're realizing the connection that we have to life, and deepening that connection, evolving as a spiritual being, and empathizing with the suffering of other people and life, and just reaching that higher level of awareness. which is a understanding of how the universe works. Einstein said also that the final view of the universe, or one of the later religions, is that of the universe, is the religion of the universe, right? Kind of like Zen. So you could say that if you want a religion that approximates that theory, look into Zen, and it talks about, all the different relations that go on in the universe, because it combines Taoism along with Buddhism, which I think is really cool, and it's at least interesting to look into. But yeah, realize that you're blessed as a human being, and you can work past any of the problems in your life, and keep working hard every day, and look into yourself, try to understand yourself, and one day you too can reach nirvana, or a new level of consciousness. And I truly believe that you can do that 100%. Okay, so this is Matt signing off. I'll catch you on my next video. I hope you enjoyed it, and have a wonderful day. Great rest of the week. Bless you, and may you be tranquil and happy in this current time that we're living through. And I wish you the best on your spiritual journey and awakening. Take care.